Let the stormy clouds chase everyone from the place. Come on with the rain, I've a smile on my face. I'll walk down the lane with a happy refrain and sing it, just sing it in the rain. I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain. What a glorious feel, I'm happy again. I'm laughing at clouds so dark above.
The sun's in my heart and I'm ready for love and song.
What?
Ah, what a nice day. The World War is over, the economy is booming, and children are still working for pennies and dead-end factory jobs. 1927. Truly a time to be alive.
Gee, Pops, these new talkie films are the bee's knees.
Did you say talkie?
Yeah, like movies with sound.
How dare they? Okay. But seriously. Sound films. Something so common that nowadays we just call them films. Over the years, sound has become an integral part of how we make and view movies all over the world. And while sound effects and music are great, the human voice is really the star of the show. With it, raw emotion is conveyed that wouldn't be delivered to the audience without it. Some of the most beloved moments ever captured on camera are loved because of the sounds that they use. I mean, dialogue is what makes movies so special. Could you imagine how the Darth Vader father reveal scene would have gone if it was silent? Yeah, kind of boring without the emotional dialogue if you ask me. In fact, sound is so important, it's hard to even imagine that there was a time without it. But, of course, there was. The widely considered first ever motion picture, Brown Hay Garden Scene, was made in 1888, and the first ever talkie, The Jazz Singer, was made in 1927. That leaves 39 years of film where sound couldn't exist at all, not even mentioning all the silent films that were made after the technology had already advanced. And considering that film itself is only 136 years old, that's almost a third of all cinematic history spent in silence. The transition from silent to sound film was not easy for studios or the general population. Most could see the potential, but it definitely took some getting used to. One of the groups who took this change especially hard were the many silent film actors, who now had to learn how to not only act with their bodies, but also their voice. Such a big invention changed the film industry forever, and no movie does a better portrayal of this tumultuous time in cinematic history than the 1952 musical classic Singing in the Rain.
I'm singing and dancing in the rain.
The movie follows a silent film actor named Don Lockwood and his comedic partner Cosmo Brown as they try and help their studio keep up with the new trend of sound film. Together, they enlist the help of the beautiful stage actress Kathy Selden to create a musical film that will blow away any competition they might face. Through the trials and tribulations of working with an ever-changing industry, Don falls for Kathy and overcomes adversity, all while saving his studio from the jaws of obscurity. The film is an amazing reflection of American culture, both from the time period it took place in and in the period it was released. With its amazing set design, costumes, songs, and lots and lots and lots and lots of dancing. But with all of the shiny and perfect main characters that we are meant to root for, the one that stands out the most, and my personal favorite character, is Lina Lamont. She's spoiled, delusional, and flat-out rude, but despite all of this, I feel that her role of the villain, so to speak, is a little undeserved. Mostly. Lina is obviously a bad person. She does some things in the film that are illegal and just flat-out wrong. But Lina represents something very important about the film industry at the time of the transition from silent to talkie films. And that's how important the sound of someone's voice was, especially for women. Up until this point, actors were not cast because of how they talked. It was mostly because of how they looked. And several actors in real life went through very similar situations as Lina. In the film, Lina Lamont is a beautiful, silent movie star who is beloved by all because of her many appearances alongside Don Lockwood. In fact, she is so loved that people hope that she and Don get married due to their palpable on-screen chemistry. The gag with Lina is that she's beautiful, but her voice is obnoxious.
What's wrong with the way I talk? What's the big idea? Am I dumb or something?
They try and do everything to keep her from talking in interviews and public appearances so that her image doesn't get ruined. With the introduction of sound film, however, this becomes harder and harder, especially now that they're trying to do a musical. So, Dawn brings up the idea of replacing Lina's voice with Kathy Selden's voice instead, by having her dub over all the recordings. Lina originally gets angry about this, but when she sees how much people like Kathy's voice, she decides to try and make it so that Kathy is her uncredited voice forever, so that she won't get replaced. For her purposes as a villain, this is perfectly fine motivation, but if we take into account the competitive nature of Hollywood during the silent film era, and the kinds of contracts that actors were signing, her actions begin to make a lot more sense.
Of course she's got to do it. She's got a 5-year contract with me. Get over to that microphone, Selden.
You heard of Kathy, now do it.
Contracts in film from the 1920s into the 1930s were different than the ones that we know today. Back then, actors would sign to one specific studio for an allotted time and a flat salary. Actors didn't really have control over their contracts after this. There were only a few big studios that made lucrative movies, so there weren't very many options either. And when you take into account that the Great Depression is right around the corner when Singing in the Rain takes place, finding a job as an actor was becoming harder and harder. This meant that studios took advantage of this desperation in order to create powerful contracts to hold over their actors' heads. So, actors were not allowed to leave during their allotted contract time with a specific studio, but that didn't mean that the studio wasn't able to get rid of actors they deemed less than favorable. During the 1920s, one of the most famous silent film actors, named Fatty Arbuckle, was accused of murdering fellow actress Virginia Rapp. This caused one of the biggest scandals of the 20s. And, of course, it ruined Arbuckle's reputation. And even though he was acquitted in his trials, his public image was forever ruined. This all happened before his contract with Universal Studios had expired. In order for studios to let go of actors that they no longer wanted in their films, they created the morality clause, which was basically a backdoor plan to get rid of any of the actors that the public deemed undesirable. Universal's morality clause read, "The actor or actress agrees to conduct himself or herself with due regard to public conventions and morals, and agrees that he or she will not do or commit anything tending to degrade him or her in society or bring him or her into public hatred, contempt, scorn, or ridicule, tending to shock, insult, or offending the community, or outrage public morals or decency, or tending to the prejudice of the Universal Film Manufacturing Company or the motion picture industry. In an event that the actor or actress violates any term or provision of this paragraph, then the Universal Film Manufacturing Company has the right to cancel and annul his contract by giving 5 days' notice to the actor or actress if its intention is to do so." And although Universal was the first studio to do this, they started a trend that most of the other studios followed. This clause was abused during its use in the 20s. Because of the vague wording, it made it possible for actors' contracts to be ripped from them if the studio thought that they were no longer lucrative for any reason, including ones that were out of their control. But the important thing to remember is that they specifically mentioned public scorn as a reason that an actor might have their contract revoked.
And I can't stand him.
And I can't stand him.
Can't.
Can't.
Accents. For as long as people could speak, we've had accents. Depending on what language we speak, our voices and the way we pronounce things will sound different. But there's also accent differentiation between people who speak the same language as well. In most classic American cinema, you might notice that the actors talk with a certain cadence, one that doesn't really seem to be all that prevalent today. But when you hear it, you can't help but think of the silver screens of old. This is called the transatlantic or mid-Atlantic accent. This accent was super popular in movies all the way through the early 1950s. You could see this in Singing in the Rain. Even though the movie was made about the 20s, it still came out in the 50s, and the way that the actors portray themselves reflects that. But where did this accent come from, and why was it so popular in movies? Well, back before sound film, most plays and theatrical productions were performed with British accents. America had a lot of influence from the British, considering how they used to be a colony of Great Britain. Especially throughout the 1900s, there was a lot of cultural influences coming from the Industrial Revolution. British society was seen as sophisticated and something to be admired, and as something to strive for. Because of this, having a British accent immediately made someone seem more sophisticated than someone without one. In hoping to also appear high class, many wealthy Americans adopted the transatlantic accent in order to fit in and seem more high society. The accent consists of many British speech patterns with an American flair, almost blending the two together to form an entirely new sound, and that is the accent we know and love in movies today. And considering how movies are supposed to be an escape from our real lives, why wouldn't we give every character the accents of the rich? But with the development of accents for the rich, there also comes the development of accents for the working class. And although it might be hard to imagine today, there was a time in history when people didn't have the radio or TV to hear what anyone else sounded like. For a lot of poorer people, all they had to go off of was their families. Because of this lack of transportation and ability to travel, as well as the education availability in certain areas, the pronunciation of certain words and phrases began to sound entirely different depending on the region and the class of the person talking. This made it extremely easy to tell who was from high society and who was from the working class. But silent filmmakers didn't have to worry about this because they didn't have sound to hold them back. A lot of early directors didn't exactly have the money to hire the most popular actors and actresses, especially when people weren't even sure if film would take off and become successful. So they had to rely on the working class to fill those roles. Several of the most popular film stars at the time came from poverty, broken homes, and other situations that you wouldn't expect stars to be born from. But despite it all, the popularity of film was able to bring them into the spotlight. However, the introduction of talkies really changed everything. No longer were their voices going to be kept on silent. They were going to have to reveal to everyone that they weren't the glamorous movie stars everyone thought they were. They were just people. But the public already had a vision of them based off of their face and what they thought they were. Many actors had to go through rigorous voice training just to make sure that their image matched the face they saw on screen. Many actors' careers ended up declining after the introduction of talkies because people didn't get what they expected. And although Lina's backstory was never explicitly mentioned in the movie, it's heavily implied that she rose to stardom in the same way that a lot of the other silent film actors did at the time.
Away from her. People just don't do things like that.
People! I ain't people!
So why am I sitting here saying that Lina Lamont isn't the bad guy? Well, that's because she isn't. She's a woman who's being held back by a powerful studio and is going to be forced to give up her entire career if she doesn't comply with what they want. Now, that doesn't mean she was entirely right for everything she did either. She did threaten Kathy's career as a result, but honestly, in a world where women are often pit against each other, this isn't too far from being realistic. Lina is convinced that there can only be one star at a time, probably because that's how Hollywood was. If you weren't the it girl, you weren't anyone. This would obviously make anyone mad, especially considering the fact that replacing her with Kathy wasn't even the director's idea. It was Don Lockwood's idea, the male co-star who already has more power over her as a man. As we know, the contract Lina was under most likely included public scorn as a reason that it could be terminated. We see in the movie as she sits and watches the preview for her latest talkie as the crowd laughs at her. Laughing at her voice, at her performance, at everything. That preview didn't go so well for Don either. He made his fair share of blunders, but the studio doesn't blame him for any of it because they're too busy using Lina's working class accent as a scapegoat. Lina is caught in the middle of a power imbalance between her male co-star, her male co-star's assistant, and the composer of the entire musical that she's supposed to be starring in, as well as the studio executive who is holding her contract over her head. So keeping that in mind, how does she decide to solve the problem? Of course, by playing dirty back. It's the only thing that she can do. And Kathy doesn't even get much of a say in any of this either. The entire movie, the men around her are telling her what to do and what to say, making her into the object that Lina should direct her rage at. And then, after she directs that rage exactly where they want it to go, they swoop in and save Kathy, becoming her hero and further painting Lina as the villain. They keep everything a secret from Lina. They don't even really try and talk to her about perhaps using a voice dub or taking on a different role. Instead, they keep her in the dark until they decide that they're inevitably going to replace her with somebody that they deem as prettier and more talented than she is. And to that, some people might say that Lina doesn't really deserve this kind of sympathy. She's selfish, she's full of herself, she disrespects her boundaries in the relationship with Don, and she's also pretty rude to everyone around her. And to that I say, Don does the exact same stuff. He's extremely selfish and extremely full of himself. So selfish, in fact, that he's willing to sacrifice Lina's career just because he doesn't like her. Even though the preview made it clear that Lina's voice was a problem, Don is the one who is extremely pushy when it comes to replacing Lina entirely. He even suggested the idea of doing a musical because he already had Kathy in mind. He knew Lina couldn't sing and that she'd need a voice. This was all part of his plan to get closer to the woman he'd hoped would be his girlfriend. And talking about boundaries is laughable considering how Dawn meets Kathy in the first place. He hops into her car running from the paparazzi and decides to insult her way of life and her career. But yeah, what a stand-up guy. And the only big difference between Lina and Dawn, besides the fact that Dawn is a man, is the way that they talk. Dawn doesn't sound like an annoying working-class poor girl, so he can stay on the movie. Kathy is a woman, but she sounds rich, so she's allowed to stay too. Even Cosmo Brown, who was not hired by the studio as an actor, was able to stay and have a successful career because Dawn wanted him there. But let's review the facts. Lina Lamont most likely grew up poor. This is evident by her accent and by the way she treats fame and material possessions. She sees them as fleeting and will do anything to keep them. We can assume this means she knows what it's like to not have those things. She was probably cast into stardom based on her looks before there was ever a need to worry about her voice. She's grown to have a fan base where people love her and compliment her all the time. They're constantly telling her that she should marry Don Lockwood, and her identity is never far from his. It's always Dawn and Lina. Sure, she may not be the best at getting the hint, but we've already established that she probably didn't have a great education, and I can't imagine her social life was much better before stardom. Suddenly, sound film is being created, and she's excited to be a part of it, only to have everyone around her laugh. The accent that was a mark of where she came from is now a problem and getting in the way. She tries to rid herself of who she was by going to a vocal coach, but when that doesn't work, she decides to just be herself anyway. Even after putting herself out there, she's told that her voice will have to be replaced by another woman's because it isn't good enough. And the only reason this woman is being considered in the first place is because Dawn said so, and he is in love with her. The tabloids, of course, are going to be on the side of Don Lockwood because he's the man. If he decides to leave Lina, then there's no more Lina and Dawn, and not only will she lose her contract with the studio that's keeping her afloat, she'll be ruined by all of the public hatred she's gonna get after being branded as the other woman. The only way to stand up to these men, who have up until this point decided her life for her, is to threaten them with legal action. But after everything she went through, and all of the risks she put to try and stay on top, it ends up with her being humiliated in front of all of her fans, because they still have the final say. You can call it karma if you want, but I personally think that Lina Lamont is a victim of the system that she is a part of. And I know that's not exactly an original thought, considering that, yeah, sexism was pretty much everywhere, but this movie is still extremely popular today, and the amount of times I've seen Lina referred to as some pretty nasty things just always gets me confused. It seems like something we would have realized by now, right? But apparently not. So, next time you watch Singing in the Rain, I implore you to think a little bit more critically about how the characters are portrayed and who the good guys really are.